Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for another episode in our series of Where Do I Start? Today, I'm joined by Brad Lutz, who's the president of our firm, Acuity HR Solutions. Hey, Brad.
Hey there. How's it going, Jaysa?
Good, really good. And so for
Good.
those of you who are tuning in for your very first conversation that we've had, we've been conducting a number of these with our team. And our team at Acuity here, we're located in the heart of the Winnipeg Exchange District, and we focus on HR consulting, HR projects, recruitment, training, and leadership development. So we have a number of different service areas that we support our clients in. And if you're interested in hearing more about us, you can visit our website at www.acuityhr.ca. You can also follow our company page on LinkedIn. There's a lot of great resources that we post, and this is one of them. So without further ado, we're going to jump into our topic today. And the topic is around employment contracts. This seems to be a very busy time of year for us for a number of different things. But when it comes to employment contracts and policies and handbooks, I think people get the back to school vibe and the feel, and they kind of realize, oh, if this was a project on my list, I want to get it done in the fall. So we've had a lot of inquiries about that. And we want to talk a little bit about the differences that we see, because when we get client information, a lot of the times organizations have letters of offer in place that they give to people, or at times they don't at all. And there is definitely a significant difference between a letter of offer and an employment contract. So Brad's going to talk about that and a whole host of other things that are important that you want to consider when it comes to a robust employment contract, whether it be termination provisions or other components. So Brad, I'll let you take it away, and here we go.
Hey, thank you so much, Jaysa. Yeah, when it comes to employment contracts, there are definitely a few things that you really want to consider when you provide that. A lot of people will call it the letter of offer, but it really should be an employment agreement when you give that to a prospective employee. And there are a few things that you want to put in there. And, unfortunately, I'm a bit of a pessimist when it comes to these things, because I see all too often on the other side when the employment relationship is ended. And oftentimes, you're left with a situation with a client that doesn't really have anything in place that defines how that ending of the relationship can or should happen. And then you're left with kind of case law provisions, which are typically not very favorable towards the employer, but can be difficult even for the employee too. And Jaysa, you kind of mentioned one of the big highlights already is that when it does come to employment contracts or employment agreements, versus instead of just a simple offer letter, yeah, there are definitely a number of components that you want to have in there. Of course, you do want to have things like start date, position, compensation information. All of those things should be in there. Typically even a high level of the job profile itself. So this is the job that we're hiring you to do. Here are some of the major responsibilities, those sorts of things. But what's often not in those employment contracts are termination provisions, and you do and should start with the end in mind. One of the things that unfortunately that all HR folks have kind of come to realize is that you're not perfect hirers. You're not perfect at hiring the exact right people, and sometimes relationships over time just erode, and you want to make a decision, and somebody's going to leave the organization. Well, what does that ending look like? And those sorts of terms really should be defined in an employment contract, which you can negotiate before the person comes and accepts the offer and joins your employ. But they're pretty critical, especially when you have longer term relationships with folks. Things can get pretty expensive if they're not defined well within the context of the employment contract. So I know it's a time when everybody's kind of happy and you're hopefully entering a honeymoon stage of the employment relationship. But nonetheless, that employment contract really should talk about termination provisions and define what that looks like.
What would be some of the pitfalls, Brad, if someone didn't include a termination provision as part of a contract? What could that outlook look like for the employer? Let's talk worst case scenario, because we have seen that at times. So let's paint a bit of a picture, not to scare people, but at the same time to bring the reality to the situation of how bad it could be.
Yeah, great question, Jaysa. And it can look bad, and it's years down the road when it does look bad. Typically when you have somebody that and you're ending the employment relationship with somebody, and typically these situations are when you want to terminate somebody without cause.
Mm.
So they've not done anything that is so egregious or so bad that you're terminating their employment for cause, which of course then we know what that looks like. You're terminating the person's employment, and there is no severance package. There is no accessibility to employment standards, typically the notice periods that are defined by employment legislation, right? But when you have somebody that's been with the organization for a longer period of time and it's just not working anymore, or the company has outgrown that person, or they've just reached that point in their career where they're just not contributing in the way that you need them to contribute in the role. And again, it's not to say that they're a bad person or a bad employee, but they might not just be the right fit anymore. Or sometimes you have those relationship rubs where things just aren't meshing between groups of people, and there's a decision made to say goodbye to somebody, which can often be a very difficult decision, but sometimes a very necessary decision from a business perspective, and moving positively forward. We did have one situation. I'll share an example with one of our clients and this is a few years ago already, but this was, to your point, Jaysa, that worst case scenario. And this person basically had started their career right out of high school with the organization, had been with them. He was about 58 years old at the time, so he's probably been with the company for about 40 years at that period of time, and things weren't working, and things were in not a good space. And ultimately, the employer decided to live with a really bad and negative relationship with this guy because they couldn't afford to say goodbye to him, because case law provisions would have dictated how they said goodbye to each other, because there was no employment contract at all in place, let alone an employment contract that didn't have termination provisions. But to give you a sense of this, I mean, this person had been with the organization for about 40 years and was making a significant income level. And at that age and at that income level and at that length of service, this termination without cause was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. As you can appreciate, you were looking at a situation from a case law perspective where this person was going to get 18 to 24 months based on the province that they were in, and different provinces are a little bit different here in Canada, but in case law in that province would have been 18 to 24 months of salary continuance or a severance package based on case law provisions, and based on that person's salary level and bonus level and benefits and all of that, all those sorts of things. It was into the hundreds of thousands of dollars that the organization would have had to spend to say goodbye to that person. So typically when you get somebody that's been, with an organization for more than 5 years and certainly more than 10 years, and there are no termination provisions in place, it can be more costly than you're expecting to say goodbye if that's the situation that needs to happen. So how you avoid that worst case scenario is you define what that's going to look like at the start of employment. And I know it's the honeymoon phase again, and you don't want to be thinking about the end of the relationship at the very, very beginning of it. But it's a great way for that employee to have assurance, to know that if something doesn't work out, they'll have some monies that'll help them transition into the future without having to get a lawyer, without having to go through a court process. And the same thing on the employer side is now you have cost certainty. So you know how much it's going to cost. And you as the employer can also avoid those legal costs and those headaches and hassles and a potential negotiation that may go well or may not go as well as you would like.
Exactly.
And often when you look at those situations, typically what you would want to do is have a good understanding of what case law could provide to somebody, and also understand what employment standards would provide. You never want to provide less than what employment standards provides, because if you try and put something like that in a termination provision, it probably will get thrown out as not being enforceable because it doesn't meet the minimum legislative requirement. So you want to, at the very, very minimum, meet the employment standards requirement as part of that termination provision, and probably something a little bit more. Here in the province of Manitoba, employment standards caps out at 8 weeks of notice period. And so if you were to provide something like 12 weeks or depending on that person's length of service with the organization at the time of termination, if you were to provide 12 weeks instead of 8 weeks, now you're providing something that's in excess of employment standards. So that could be potentially attractive to the employee joining your company now. But yet you would, as the employer, would likely pay a whole lot less than what case law would expect you to pay should the situation go to a wrongful dismissal suit against you. So the wording is a little bit legalese, and if you're not kind of familiar with these types of contracts, you definitely want to be talking with either your kind of senior HR folks that know how to word these things and have experience doing that, or certainly also an employment lawyer who can draft these sorts of provisions in a contract as well. But I know it's not popular to think about the ending of the relationship just as it's starting, but I can't tell you how many headaches would have been saved. It's unfortunately, as part of Acuity's business and the work that I work on as part of Acuity's team, I all too often see terminations where, we're trying to mitigate risk and mitigate, the amount of cost that's going to come out of a situation, because either there is no employment contract in place or the employment contract is completely silent when it comes to termination provisions. I just can't tell you how many headaches would be saved, if you could put these things into place at the very beginning of the relationship.
And at the end of the day, employment contracts, whether you're new to HR or whether you're an organization that simply hasn't taken a good, strong look at your employment contracts, they're supposed to be in place to protect not only the organization, but also the employee. It's in everyone's best interest to start a relationship off on the right foot. So like Brad mentioned, if it's feeling like the honeymoon phase, it still is a part of that foundation and starting the relationship off right. And it doesn't have to be adversarial or negative. And it's something, honestly, that a lot of employees that have come from more robust HR environments come to expect anyways. So it's something that you're not offside by detailing and making sure is very clear to people that are incoming. But what else, Brad? What are some other things that people need to consider when it comes to making a robust employment contract and an employment agreement versus just being a letter of offer?
Absolutely. Yeah, and great point, Jaysa. And when it does come to the termination side of things, you're right. A lot of people will come to expect those provisions, especially when you start getting into senior managerial roles and executive roles. They often won't even accept an offer unless those termination provisions are defined and agreed upon as part of the negotiation process up front. So great point on that for sure. Yeah, other things that are important. I mean, obviously, salary is a really interesting topic still, and it's been for well over a decade now, and especially depending on which province you come from. But what does overtime look like? Defining salary provisions. Even if you do have a salary employee, if there's nothing defined, in terms of what that salary agreement looks like, or what does that salary pay for, there are times when salaried employees will come back and say, well, you're terminating my employment, or I'm just not happy with you right now. So here's the 200 hours of overtime that I've worked over the last 6 months, and you're going to pay them to me. I'm going to go to employment standards. So oftentimes defining what the expectations are from a salary perspective, like is there some overtime? Could somebody say, hey, we do work longer hours for stretches of the year while we're working with certain projects, or certain times of the year are busier than others. So we will expect, and your salary pays you for up to 45 or 50 hours a week per, at times during the year, but we'll also give you some flexibility. So that way, when things are slower, if you want to put in a 30 or 35-hour work week, that's okay too. And your salary is set up in a way to accommodate some of those fluctuations or some of those extra hours. That is perfectly acceptable to put in an employment contract, and even recommended if you know that you're hiring a salary person and the demands at times are going to be beyond an 8-hour day or a 40-hour work week. Build that into the employment contract, so that way, the person 6 months from now says, well, I worked these 50 hours of overtime, now pay me. No. We've got an employment contract in place, and it says that there's going to be some fluctuation of hours, including some hours beyond 8 per day or 40 per week, and define those. And it has to be reasonable. I mean, you can't expect somebody to say, well, we expect you to work up to 80 hours per week. That's not going to be reasonable, and that's not going to be seen as an enforceable provision. It has to be reasonable. And if you're kind of setting up somebody's salary in a way to say, hey, we're going to pay them a little bit more, but we do know that some weeks it's going to be a 50-hour work week, and other weeks it might be a bit slower, but we're setting up your salary in a way to accommodate up to a 50-hour work week, that's okay. And that's reasonable. As long as that salary level definitely exceeds what would have been paid on a minimum wage basis, then that's totally cool. So those salary arrangements are pretty important for salaried employees to include in the employment contract as well. A couple of other things that are pretty important, things like confidentiality, especially depending on the type of workplace. If you have clients that require that their information be kept confidential, or even suppliers, or even business processes that might be unique to, even within your industry, unique to your organization, those are things from a confidentiality standpoint that are pretty important to include as part of the employment agreement. And if they're creating, some materials, or, for a training organization that might be creating training courses, you want to protect some of the intellectual property and some of the creative things that might be created in the course of employment, that those things belong to the employer, and the employee can't take those things with them when they leave the organization. IT firms are usually pretty keen on ensuring that intellectual property and things created, in the course of employment are the property of the employer. And those things are pretty common to see in an employment contract as well. Other things that are pretty important, we talked about confidentiality. I'll talk a little bit about non-competition and non-solicitation. Non-competes are difficult to enforce. They are difficult to define, even for a geographic area, or the exact type of things that you might be competing on if somebody leaves your organization to join another company or to join one of your competitors. I tend not to spend a ton of time thinking about non-competes, because most organizations don't have the means or the desire to hold people accountable to the non-compete provisions anyways. And they are difficult and at times costly to even try to enforce. But the non-solicit provisions, I think, are more important, and they are far more easy to enforce and to define as well. So things like, hey, if you leave our organization, you're not going to start poaching our clients for at least 1 year or 18 months. That is a very fair non-solicit provision. So if somebody leaves your organization, you know that they're not going to go after your clients. And if they do, you will have some remedies to try and fix that situation. But it's also, the non-solicit is not just about clients. It could also be about employees. Like, you're leaving our organization, but you're not going to tell other employees to leave with you. Often a supervisor or manager will leave an organization and then take 2 or 3 of the best superstars with them. And a non-solicit would prevent that type of poaching from happening. So those non-solicit provisions are pretty darn important as part of the employment agreement as well. But those are some of the key highlights. Definitely those termination provisions. Non-compete, I'm a little less warm to, but definitely the non-solicit, the confidentiality. Even sometimes adhering to policies, like we expect you to act ethically and adhere to the policies of the organization. I'm hit and miss with that, but it's an okay thing for sure to put in the context of the employment contract as well. But the termination, confidentiality, non-solicit, those protecting your intellectual property, those
and the overtime you mentioned as well too.
Oh yeah, the salary provision. Thank you, good catch. Those are important factors that absolutely should be considered and likely included in the context of your employment contract for sure.
Absolutely. And these things are also important to include in contracts, because employment contracts survive the employment relationship. A lot of people will say, oh, but we have that in our policies. We have that somewhere else. Employment handbooks and manuals are really only supposed to be for people that are currently employed with the organization. So if you want to have a robust contract that also survives the employment relationship, especially as Brad was mentioning, on the confidentiality side and on the non-solicit side, you need to have these things in a contract up front. So
Absolutely.
I hope for everyone that has tuned into this that you've gotten some good information and some good nuggets from this. As you can probably tell, if you're new to employment contracts or new to HR, this whole sort of area is definitely something that needs a lot of time and thought process gone into it. So if you're kind of realizing, I don't know what half the words you just said are, I'm curious about more of this stuff, I need to understand, how does case law factor into this? How do I handle this termination? That's something we can help you with. If you're realizing, hey, our organization has walked down a path and gone so far, and none of our employees have employment contracts in place, that is definitely something that we can help you walk back on, so to speak, and ensuring that your organization is protected, your employees are protected, and that you feel comfortable and confident in the nature of how your employment contracts are written. So all of those things are certainly things that we can help with. Again, hopefully you gathered some interesting information or some food for thought about the nature of how your current employment contracts are written. And if you need any support of any nature, our team is happy to provide that. You can contact us on our website. Again, that's www.acuityhr.ca. Information will be linked below, and we certainly hope that that this was helpful. So thanks, Brad. Thanks for chatting with me.
Oh, thank
And
you so much, Jaysa. It's always a pleasure.
yeah, so we'll leave that at that, but we'll look forward to people tuning in on our future conversations.